It began with flowers, fresh wild daisies laid in a perfect circle on the edge of a cornfield, their stems still wet with morning dew, their petals trembling in the wind that moved through the stalks like something alive. Walter Hensley saw them first, standing where his daughter used to walk home from school, the place where her footprints had ended 6 weeks earlier and never continued. The field was quiet, too quiet, as if the earth was holding its breath. He picked one flower up and felt the stem snap cold between his fingers. Whoever left them had been there minutes before, and that was not the first morning he found them. Every day, just before dawn, a new circle appeared in the same place, as if someone was keeping vigil, as if someone wanted him to remember. The sheriff said it was grief. The neighbors said it was faith, but Walter knew it was neither. He knew the man who brought those flowers still lived among them, still watched the house from somewhere behind the rows, still pretending to mourn what he had taken, and 50 years later, when a rusted tin box was found buried beneath that same patch of earth, the truth that had slept under the corn finally woke up. Before I tell you what was inside, take a second to like this video, leave a comment telling me what you think really happened in that field, and subscribe, because this story is about to open a door that never should have been touched. The morning started like any other in Hensley County. The air soft with the smell of rain and the corn standing tall enough to whisper. Annie left the house just after sunrise, her bicycle basket filled with school papers, a jar of strawberry jam for her teacher, and the sound of her father's voice telling her to be home before dark. She turned once at the end of the lane and waved, and that was the last time Walter Hensley ever saw his daughter alive. By afternoon, the clouds rolled heavy over the plains, gray and low, the kind that make the air feel like it is waiting for something to happen. Annie was seen leaving the school around 4 o'clock, her books pressed to her chest, her ribbon caught by the wind. The principal, Mr. Carr, asked if she needed a ride, but she smiled and said she preferred the bike, said she liked the quiet of the road. A store clerk remembered her stopping for a soda. A farmhand saw her pass the Miller property just before dusk. After that, the world swallowed her. When Walter noticed the kitchen clock creeping past 8, he stepped onto the porch, watching the road dissolve into darkness. He listened for the rattle of her bicycle chain, the sound that always came before her laughter. But all he heard was wind moving through the corn, long and hollow. He took the lantern from the hook and walked to the gate, calling her name into the night until his voice broke against the rows. They found her bicycle before midnight. It was lying on its side near the fence, one handlebar buried in the mud, the front wheel spinning slow in the breeze. Her shoes were beside it, side by side, clean as if someone had placed them there. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Just the empty road stretching between the house and the field like a line that had been cut in half. By dawn, the sheriff arrived, hat pulled low, notebook in hand, already saying the words people use when they do not want to admit what they fear. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she lost her way in the storm. Maybe she will walk home when the sun comes up. But when the first light spilled across the field and nothing moved, Walter knew none of that was true. The men searched the fields until their boots sank in mud, and the dogs went silent. They found a single hair ribbon tangled in the corn, red against the gold, and when Walter saw it he fell to his knees because it still smelled like her shampoo. The sheriff marked the spot, drew a line on his map, and called it the end of the trail. That night, the sky broke open with rain. The field flooded, washing away whatever truth had been left on the ground. And in that silence, the only thing that remained was the hum of the wind and the sound of a father whispering her name into the dark. The first flowers appeared a week after the search ended, small white daisies laid in a perfect ring on the edge of the field where her bicycle had been found. Walter saw them just after sunrise, the light still pale and trembling, the ground still wet from the storm. At first he thought they had grown there, some strange accident of nature, until he bent down and saw the stems had been cut clean, fresh, placed by hand. He picked one up and turned it between his fingers. The petals were cold, the center dark with dew. Someone had been there before him, early, quiet, close enough to touch the same earth where his daughter had vanished. He looked up at the endless rows of corn moving slow in the wind, every stalk shifting like it was hiding something. He called her name once, not because he expected an answer, but because silence felt worse. The sheriff said it was nothing. Maybe the wind carried them. Maybe some neighbor trying to be kind. But when the second morning came, and then the third, and the flowers kept returning, Walter stopped listening. He began to wait for them. Every dawn he walked out to that same spot, his boots heavy with mud, his breath leaving clouds in the cool air, and there they were again, always fresh, always new. People started to talk. They said maybe it was a sign from heaven. Maybe the girl was trying to tell her father she was at peace. The pastor wrote a sermon about faith blooming in sorrow. The newspaper sent a reporter who took a picture of Walter kneeling in the field, his hat in his hands, the caption reading, "Love Beyond the Grave." They printed it once and never again, because grief like that made people uncomfortable. But Walter saw what no one else saw. He noticed that sometimes a few petals were bruised, as if a hand had gripped them too tight. He noticed the footprints that vanished halfway down the dirt road, too deep for a child, too light for a man. And one morning, when the fog hung low and the world fell asleep, he heard a car door closing far off toward the schoolhouse road. When he turned, there was nothing but mist and the faint smell of gasoline. The sheriff came once more, tired eyes, same notebook, same promises. He told Walter to let it go, said the flowers were a ghost of memory, not a message. Walter didn't argue. He just pointed at the ground where the circle of daisies glowed against the dark soil and said, "Then tell me who keeps planting them." After that, no one came back. The town moved on. The field kept its secrets, and still the flowers grew. By the end of that summer, the field no longer sounded like wind. It sounded like whispering. Long, low voices carried through the rows at night, the kind that make you stop and listen even when you know there is nothing there. The corn had grown high, taller than a man, swaying slow under the weight of the heat, and the air hung thick with the smell of soil and rot. The flowers kept coming, one circle after another, always in the same place, always before dawn. Walter stopped sleeping. He kept a chair by the window, lamp off, shotgun leaning against the wall, eyes fixed on the field as if he could catch whoever was walking it. His neighbors called him haunted. The sheriff called him stubborn. But every morning when the sun cracked over the horizon, he would find new petals glistening in the dirt, as if someone had walked the night beside him and he never heard their steps. Rumors began to spread. Some said it was kids playing tricks. Some said it was her ghost, drawn back by her father's grief. But one story kept growing in the silence, a story that pointed to someone people trusted. They said the school principal, Mr. Carr, had taken a special interest in Annie before she disappeared, that he had kept her after class to help with grading papers, that he had even driven her home once or twice when it rained. It was harmless, they said. But in small towns, harmless can turn into something else when no one looks too closely. One night, Walter walked to the school himself. The building sat on the edge of town, its windows black and empty, the flag out front limp in the still air. He circled the gravel lot, found the door to the teacher's office unlocked, and stepped inside. The air smelled like chalk and lemon oil. On the desk were stacks of unmarked papers, a half-empty glass, and a single dried daisy pressed between two sheets of lined notebook paper. He picked it up, turned it in his hands, and something in his chest went cold. He left before anyone saw him. The next morning he took the flower to the sheriff. The man sighed, said there was no law against pressing flowers, and told Walter to go home. But when Walter looked at him, the sheriff looked away, as if he had already decided which truths were too heavy to touch. Weeks passed. The corn began to dry. The air turned sharp, and still every few mornings new flowers appeared. Walter started keeping a notebook, writing down the time, the shape of the circle, the way the petals leaned. He noticed that on Sundays there were none, as if whoever brought them believed even grief should rest. Then, in late September, a storm hit the valley. The wind tore at the fields, flattening whole rows, lightning crawling across the sky like veins of fire. Walter stayed by the window all night, waiting for the wind to take the last of the flowers. But when the rain finally stopped and the light broke through, he saw them again. Not one circle this time, but two. The second, smaller, laid right beside the first. He walked out barefoot, mud thick around his ankles, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. In the center of the smaller circle, he found something new. A piece of paper folded twice, soaked through, the ink bleeding but still readable. It was a school report card, Annie's name written at the top in the careful, slanted handwriting of the principal himself. Walter stood there a long time, the paper shaking in his hands, the field around him whispering like it was trying to warn him of something he already knew. That was the morning the sheriff stopped coming at all. The morning after the storm, the world felt scrubbed raw, the rows heavy with broken stalks, and the ground soft. Enough to take a footprint and hold it like a memory that refuses to fade. And Walter walked the perimeter with the report card folded in his pocket, because he could not bear to leave it on the table where breakfast once sat between him and his daughter. He moved slow along the fence line until he reached the north corner where the posts leaned a little, and the wire sang its thin, tired song in the wind. And there he saw a man standing very still with both hands on the top rail, as if he were praying to the land itself. Walter stopped where the grass began to flatten, and watched him the way farmers watch storms. Quiet and careful, ready to turn if the sky decides to change, the man wore a clean jacket, the kind you do not wear to work in the fields, and his shoes shone even with mud sucking around the soles. His hat sat straight and proper, like the hats of men who write letters with their full names. And when he turned his head, Walter recognized him in an instant, because everybody knew that profile, the neat line of the jaw, the glasses that caught the light, the principal from the school who always spoke with a calm voice as if calm were a proof that nothing bad could happen if you just believed hard enough. Mr. Carr heard him before he spoke. He must have, because in small places sound carries. He let go of the rail and looked over with a smile that did not reach far enough to touch his eyes, said he was out checking the damage after the storm because the district sometimes used the back road to the school, and he wanted to make sure it was passable. Said it like a favor that needed no thanks, and Walter nodded without trusting his own mouth because he could taste the metal of the night still sitting in his throat. They stood shoulder to shoulder with the fence between them, and watched the field the way men watch fires die. And Carr said he remembered Annie in the choir room, how she always lined up the sheet music by size and brought a jar of jam for the winter bake sale, how the younger girls copied her handwriting because it was careful and pretty, how most students leave but some stay in the air like the ghost of chalk dust long after the board is clean. And Walter clenched his jaw until it ached, because kindness spoken like that can feel like a shadow pressed against your back. Carr asked if the sheriff had found anything new, and Walter shook his head. He thought of the report card in his pocket and of the daisies that kept arriving like a habit no one could break. He thought of the pressed flower he had seen on the principal's desk, and of the unlocked door that had taken him into a room where the air smelled like lemon oil and patience. And he said only that the land keeps its own counsel, that sometimes it takes and sometimes it gives. And Carr nodded with a slow, thoughtful motion, as if this were a scripture he repeated to himself at night. A car passed on the far road, and the wind shifted, and brought with it that faint, sharp breath of gasoline that had haunted Walter since the morning he heard a door close in the fog, and he saw Carr lift his chin and inhale the same air. And for a fraction of a second the man's face opened with something like recognition, before it folded back into the schoolroom calm that told parents not to worry because he had seen boys fight and girls cry, and nothing surprised him any more. Walter asked him a small question, the way fishermen cast a quiet line to see what stirs beneath. He asked whether the school still kept old records. He said Annie used to bring home grade sheets with notes written in a slanted hand. He said he wondered if any copies ever found their way back to the office. And Carr answered without missing breath that the district archived everything for a few years, and then cleared space when the cabinets filled. He said papers were papers, and could not keep a person from leaving. He said it gently, like a teacher correcting a child who had confused hope with fact. Walter leaned on the rail and let his gaze fall to the ground on Carr's side of the fence, where the mud held a few shallow marks that were not quite prints and not quite nothing. Just the suggestion that someone had stood there before the storm and shifted their weight enough times to make the earth memorize the habit. And he wondered how far a man could carry secrets while standing so straight. Wondered how many small motions it takes to become a ritual. Hand to the rail, eyes to the field, breath in and out until the heart believes itself innocent. Carr cleared his throat and said he had to be going. Because the morning was getting on and the teachers would be expecting him, he reached across the fence and set his hand for a moment on Walter's shoulder in a gesture meant to look fatherly, the grip light but steady the way you would calm a skittish horse. And he said that grief can make patterns out of accidents, that flowers appear where you choose to notice them, that a mind will plant meaning where the ground is bare. And Walter felt the words slide over him like cold water, because they sounded practiced. They sounded like something a man tells himself every time dawn comes and finds him already awake. When Carr walked away, he took the back path that skirted the ditch and disappeared behind the cottonwoods. He did not look back, and Walter stayed where he was until the wind changed again, and the wire sang a different note. Then he reached into his pocket and unfolded the soaked report card and spread it flat against the top rail so the sun could touch the ink. And he traced the careful slanted letters of the principal's name, letter by letter, patient as a man sharpening a blade, and he told the field in a voice that barely carried to his own ears that he was done waiting for the sheriff to believe in the shape flowers make when they are laid by a steady hand. That night, he moved the chair from the window to the porch and sat with the lantern dark and the shotgun across his knees, not because he planned to use it, but because weight sometimes reminds a man he is still here. He listened to the rows breathing, and to the small lives that wake when the sun goes down, and when the hour drew thin he heard it again, that soft, far sound of a car door closing somewhere beyond the trees, a sound small enough to ignore if you wanted to keep your peace, a sound large enough to carry a life if you had already lost one. By the time the frost came, the flowers had stopped. The mornings grew pale and brittle, the ground hard enough to ring under the heel of a boot, and the wind carried that sharp smell of metal that comes when the soil begins to freeze. Walter still walked the fence line every day, not because he expected to find anything new, but because routine was the only thing that kept the world from collapsing. The sheriff had long since stopped visiting, the neighbors stopped asking, and the field had gone silent again, the way it does when it believes no one is listening. Then, one morning near the end of November, Walter noticed something strange. The lowest row of corn had been turned, the stalks flattened in a perfect square about the size of a small table. The rest of the field stood untouched. He crouched down, brushed away a layer of frost, and saw the corner of something metal beneath the soil. It caught the light just enough to look like a small star trapped underground. He dug with his hands until his fingers burned and pulled up a tin box, dented, sealed with a strip of rusted wire. He carried it inside and set it on the kitchen table beside the lamp. The box smelled of earth and rot and faintly of oil. He hesitated, staring at it for a long time, as if opening it might change more than just the morning. When he finally cut the wire with a pocket knife and lifted the lid, the air inside came out warm, like breath held too long. Inside were papers, folded small and pressed together in neat stacks. School assignments, pages of math problems written in Annie's careful hand, all marked with the same slanted signature, Edwin Carr. Underneath them, photographs. Some were class pictures, the kind everyone had seen in the yearbook, but others were not. They showed Annie standing by her bicycle in front of the school, laughing, her hair tied back with the same ribbon the sheriff had logged as evidence months earlier. In one photograph, she was writing on the blackboard, and behind her, barely visible in the reflection of the window, stood Carr. Walter felt the air leave his chest. He flipped through the rest of the box and found a letter at the bottom, folded into a small square, the paper yellowed and damp at the edges. The handwriting was careful, the ink still dark. It read, "She was never supposed to be alone. I promised to watch over her." He dropped the letter onto the table and stepped back. For a long time, he just stared at it, the lamplight shaking across the page. The meaning was too clear and too cruel. He thought of all those mornings, the flowers laid in circles, the smell of gasoline, the man at the fence pretending to pray. Walter went to the phone and called the sheriff's office, but no one answered. He called again and again until the line hummed with nothing but static. So he waited. The day turned to evening. When the first stars came out, he lit the lantern, took the box, and walked toward the field. The air was sharp enough to bite, the moon hanging low and red. He buried the box again, deeper this time, under the same patch of ground where he had found it. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because some truths felt too heavy to leave on the surface. When he covered the last of the soil, he stood there in the cold and whispered her name. For the first time in months, no wind answered. 2 days later, when he returned to check the spot, the ground was smooth again. Not a sign of where he had dug, but there, right in the center, lay a single daisy. Fresh, white, perfect. Walter fell to his knees. He understood then that the box was never meant for him to find. It was a message, a confession hidden in plain sight, left by someone who wanted to be caught but couldn't bring himself to speak. That night he drove into town, the box on the seat beside him, and parked outside the school. The windows were lit from inside, shadows moving behind the curtains. In one of them he saw the faint outline of a man sitting alone at a desk, head bowed, hands folded like prayer. The same hands that had written the letter. The same man who had promised to protect what he destroyed. Walter watched for a long time, the engine running low, the cold creeping up his arms, and when he finally turned the key and drove away, the light in the office flickered once and went dark. The field behind him lay still, the frost settling again over the earth, and the wind carried nothing but the whisper of petals falling onto frozen ground. Winter came early that year, the kind that turns the horizon into glass and makes sound travel farther than it should, so that a hammer striking in one barn could be heard 3 fields away. And Walter worked in silence, his breath a pale cloud, the tin box locked inside the drawer of his desk. He told himself he had done enough, that the sheriff would come soon, that the letter would speak for itself. But the days passed, one after another, until even the cold grew tired of waiting. When the sheriff finally arrived, he was not alone. 2 deputies stood behind him, hands in their coat pockets, eyes fixed on the ground. They listened to Walter's story, nodded at the right moments, wrote down a few words on a pad that would later disappear into an archive drawer, and promised to take the box to Lincoln for analysis. But something in their faces told Walter they did not believe him. Or worse, that they believed him too much, and preferred the comfort of forgetting. The next week, when he drove into town to ask for an update, the sheriff said the papers had been misplaced during transport, lost in the system. He said it with the tone of a man who had learned that the easiest way to keep peace in a small town is to bury the noise. By Christmas, no one mentioned Annie any more. The church put up its nativity scene. The choir sang the same hymns she used to love, and when Walter stood in the back pew, people looked past him like he was part of the furniture. The paper stopped printing her name. New babies were born, new gossip filled the diner, and the field that had once been searched by half the county went quiet again. Only one man seemed to remember. Mr. Carr. He continued to visit Walter's farm under the pretense of checking on the fences after the storm. He brought bread from his wife, asked about the crops, spoke with the same slow gentleness that made people trust him. Sometimes he left before Walter could answer. Other times he lingered by the field, watching the ground as if waiting for something to rise from it. He told Walter once that grief is a living thing, that if you feed it long enough it starts to look like company, and Walter wanted to tell him that guilt works the same way, but the words never made it out of his throat. In the spring thaw the soil loosened and the flowers returned. At first only 1 or 2, then more, scattered across the edge of the property, like a memory trying to take root again. Walter stopped touching them. He let them stay, each one a reminder that truth does not die. It just goes quiet until the right wind blows. The years rolled forward, measured not in days but in harvests. New faces filled the town. The old school was torn down, rebuilt in brick and glass, and no one spoke of the girl who never came home. Walter grew gray, his hands rough as bark, his back bent from work, and when he finally passed, there were only 3 people at his funeral: the pastor, the undertaker, and the man who had once promised to watch over his daughter. Carr stood at the grave a long time after the others had gone. He placed a small bouquet of daisies on the mound of fresh soil and whispered something that the wind carried away before it reached the trees. Then he turned, straightened his coat, and walked back toward town with the slow, even steps of a man who knows how to leave no trace. For 50 years, no one dug that land again. The Hensley farm changed owners. The fences fell. The road was paved, and the people who once swore they would never forget learned to speak her name only in stories told to children who did not believe in ghosts. But the earth never forgot. In the spring of 2001, when a construction crew came to clear the property for a new subdivision, the backhoe hit something solid 6 feet down. At first they thought it was stone, then metal, then bone. And when the first shovel struck through the frost and opened a pocket of air older than memory, the smell that came out was not of soil. It was of time, breaking open. The morning the ground gave up its secret was brighter than it had any right to be. The crew started early, engines humming, the scent of diesel mixing with thawed earth. The men joked, smoked, and worked until the machine struck something that refused to yield. The driver cut the engine, climbed down, and crouched in the pit. What he saw at first looked like an old tin lunchbox, rusted and half-eaten by soil. He pried it loose, brushed it off with his glove, and saw letters faintly carved into the lid. A.H. He called for the foreman. Within an hour, the sheriff's office had taped off the site. By noon, the field was crawling with uniforms and whispers. The sheriff, a younger man now, one who had grown up hearing the name Hensley only in warnings, stood by the pit and watched as a state investigator knelt in the mud with gloved hands. They lifted the box, set it on a tarp, and cracked the corroded clasp. Inside lay what time had spared: fragments of paper, 2 black and white photographs, and a small piece of fabric folded so precisely it could only have been placed there by someone who cared. The fabric was pale blue, and when the investigator shook it gently, a single daisy petal fell onto the mud. The photographs were clearer than anyone expected. One showed a teenage girl beside a bicycle, her smile wide, her hair caught mid-motion. The other showed her at a blackboard, chalk in hand, the shadow of a tall man just visible at the edge of the frame. The sheriff looked closer, then called for the evidence technician. Beneath the surface grime, pressed against the paper, were faint fingerprints, larger than a woman's, perfectly preserved where the moisture had sealed them in. Word spread faster than the wind. Reporters came from Omaha and Lincoln, cameras flashing against the glare of the sun. They asked about the box, about the girl, about the man whose name still lingered in old newspaper clippings: Edwin Carr. The next morning, the county courthouse announced a formal reopening of the Hensley case. Files long forgotten were pulled from storage, yellowed pages curling at the edges, evidence logs written in ink that had bled and faded. The original confession letter, she was never supposed to be alone, had vanished decades earlier, but the discovery of the box gave them a reason to look again. The sheriff ordered DNA analysis on the fabric, the petals, and the paper. While the tests were running, a retired deputy came forward. His name was Morgan Tate, one of the men who had once searched the fields shoulder to shoulder with Walter. His voice trembled as he spoke. He remembered delivering that tin box to the station back in '51. He remembered the sheriff saying it would be sent to Lincoln. And he remembered who had signed it out of evidence 2 days later for educational archiving purposes. The signature matched the man they had all trusted, the principal of Hensley High. When investigators reached out to the school board, they found that Carr had retired in 1968, moved 2 towns over, and was now living in a care facility outside Hastings. He was 89 years old, frail and nearly blind. But when detectives arrived and said the words Annie Hensley, he straightened in his chair like someone hearing their own name after a long sleep. They asked if he remembered her. He said he remembered every student. They showed him the photograph. His fingers trembled as they traced the hair above her face, never touching, just remembering. They asked if he ever visited the Hensley farm after she vanished. He said sometimes he brought flowers to pray. They asked why he kept her papers all those years. He said a teacher never forgets his best pupil. The investigators exchanged a glance. Then they slid the photo of the blackboard across the table, the one with the shadow behind her. They pointed to the reflection. Carr leaned closer, his breath shallow, his lips barely moving. "That's me," he whispered. "But I don't remember the picture being taken." 2 days later, the DNA tests came back. The sample from the fabric matched residue taken from the ink on the letter stored in the courthouse archive. Both belonged to Edwin Carr. The sheriff folded the report, slid it across the table to the county prosecutor, and said quietly, "We just found the man who never stopped visiting that field." The arrest warrant was signed before sunset. The interview room was too warm for the middle of winter. A single lamp buzzed above the table, its light trembling against the pale paint that peeled from the walls. The camera in the corner clicked on with a soft, mechanical sigh. Sheriff Dalton sat across from Edwin Carr, a nurse in the doorway, a recorder on the table between them. The old man's hands rested on his knees, thin as twigs, liver-spotted and trembling, his breathing shallow like the ticking of a slow clock. For a long moment no one spoke. Dalton waited, watching how Carr's eyes moved over the room as if looking for a chalkboard, a desk, anything familiar. When the silence stretched too long, the sheriff opened a file and slid a photograph across the table. It was the image of Annie at the blackboard, the one where the faint reflection of a tall figure lingered behind her. Carr looked down, and the lines of his face shifted not shock, not fear, but recognition. "You remember this day?" the sheriff asked. Carr nodded once. "She was bright," he said quietly. "Smarter than most. Always stayed late to help me tidy the classroom." She said the silence after everyone left made her feel safe. He smiled at the memory, small and soft, and then the smile broke. "That night," he continued, "I told her I would drive her home. The storm was coming in. The roads were empty." He stopped. His throat moved once, dry. Dalton leaned forward. "Go on." "She didn't want a ride," Carr said. "She said she liked the air, said she liked how the corn sounded when the wind moved through it. I followed her anyway. I told myself it was for her safety, but that wasn't true. I wanted to talk to her, just a little longer." The room went quiet except for the hum of the lamp. "I caught up to her by the old fence," he said. "She stopped when she saw my car. I told her she should come with me, that it wasn't safe to walk that late. She said she'd rather walk. She smiled to make it gentle, but she meant it. And that smile." He looked down at his hands. "It made me angry, not at her, but at the space she kept between us, like I was something she had to stay kind to." Dalton said nothing. He knew to let silence do its work. "I grabbed her arm," Carr whispered. "I only meant to stop her, but she pulled back, and I pushed harder than I thought I could. She fell. The ground was soft from the rain. I called her name, but she didn't move. Her head had hit the edge of the road." His voice wavered. "I waited for her to breathe, but she didn't. I tried to lift her, to carry her to the car. I didn't mean for it to happen. You have to understand that. I thought if I buried her, if I prayed, maybe God would take the memory instead of me. Dalton stared at him, jaw tight. You took her to the field. Carr nodded. I dug with my hands until the soil turned to mud. I laid her there with her ribbon and the flowers she carried for the church. I wanted it to look peaceful. He swallowed hard. The next morning I went back. I brought fresh daisies. I told myself it was penance. Every year after that I brought more. On her birthday, on mine, on the day the frost came. He covered his face with both hands. When the sheriff came to my office, I pressed one daisy between paper so she'd never be forgotten. I thought that was mercy. I see now it was something else entirely. Dalton let the silence stretch, the only sound the soft whir of the camera. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Why did you keep her papers, Mr. Carr?" "Because I couldn't let go," the old man said. "Because part of her was still there in the writing. Because she was kind when I didn't deserve kindness." He looked up, eyes wet but calm. I didn't stop visiting the field because I was haunted. I stopped because the flowers finally stopped growing where I laid them. The earth didn't want me there anymore. Dalton clicked off the recorder. The light in the room dimmed slightly, as if the air itself had exhaled. When the deputies led Carr away, the nurse asked if she should fetch him a coat. Dalton shook his head. "He won't feel the cold," he said. "He's been living in it for 50 years. That night, as the sheriff sat alone at his desk, he opened the file one last time and read the words written in fading ink. She was never supposed to be alone. For the first time in half a century, he believed it wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was a confession carved straight into the heart of the land. The news broke before sunrise. By 8 o'clock, the story had already reached every corner of Nebraska. Radios carried the headline in flat, careful tones. 89-year-old man confesses to 1951, murder of local girl. The voice of the anchor trembled slightly at the end, as if afraid to let the words rest in the air too long. By noon, the town that had once built its peace on forgetting found itself dragged back into memory. Reporters stood outside the old schoolhouse, their breath turning white in the cold. Cameras pointed at bricks that had seen everything and said nothing for 50 years. The locals came quietly, drawn by something between guilt and curiosity. Some crossed themselves. Others shook their heads and whispered that they had always suspected it. Most simply stared at the place where innocence had ended and routine had begun. At the courthouse, Sheriff Dalton held a press conference. The room was too small, filled with microphones, the smell of coffee, and the restless shuffle of paper. He read from a prepared statement, his voice even and his jaw tight. Evidence collected from the Hensley property and subsequent interviews with former school principal Edwin Carr confirm his involvement in the disappearance and death of 16-year-old Annie Hensley. The investigation is now officially closed. Questions followed fast. Why now? How could a man hide something for half a century? Why did no one suspect the principal, the one person trusted by every family in town? Dalton gave the same answer each time. Because he looked like safety. Carr was moved to the county jail under medical supervision. Reporters described him as frail, polite, and strangely calm. He spent his first night in silence, his second writing letters that no one would ever read. When asked why he confessed after all this time, he said only that the sound of wind through corn had begun to keep him awake again, and that it was time for the field to rest. The town did not rest. The local paper printed old photographs of Annie, her choir dress, her bicycle, her eyes too alive for black and white. Beneath them was the principal's portrait from the yearbook, his smile fixed and dignified. People tore the copies down by morning. In the diner, the talk ran circles. Some said forgiveness. Others said justice came too late to matter. At the edge of town, a bulldozer idled beside the half-finished subdivision. Construction had been halted out of respect, but no one came to claim the land. The developer said he would sell it cheap, yet no one bought it. The soil had a reputation now. The sheriff visited the site once more. The tape was gone, the hole filled, the earth smoothed and quiet. He stood where the box had been found, boots sinking slightly in the thawing mud, and thought about Walter Hensley, about how a man could carry truth alone until it turned into a kind of prayer. The air was still, but for a moment he swore he smelled daisies. That night, under the harsh light of the county lockup, Edwin Carr's heart stopped in his sleep. The nurse found him with his hands folded neatly on the table, his last letter open in front of him. It read, "Tell her father the flowers were never for her grave. They were for forgiveness. No one claimed his body." The church held a brief service. The pastor read from Psalms, his voice steady but hollow. In the final pew sat an old woman who had once been one of his students. She wept quietly, not because she forgave him, but because she finally believed what everyone had spent decades pretending not to see: that monsters do not come from the dark. They grow in the places where kindness is easiest to fake. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying dust and seed and the faint scent of something sweet. On the empty field where it all began, a few wild daisies bent in the breeze, their petals trembling as if listening. And when the moon climbed high and silver over Hensley County, the land exhaled. Spring returned quietly, the way forgiveness sometimes does, slow and almost unnoticeable until it is already there. The snow melted into the furrows, feeding the soil that had held its breath for half a century. The wind no longer carried whispers, only the steady hum of life coming back. Grass grew where the old fence had fallen, and the corn rose again, green and tall, as if the land had decided to begin over. The Hensley farm was nothing but a field now. The house had collapsed years earlier, the porch swallowed by weeds, the chimney leaning like a tired sentinel that no longer remembered what it was guarding. Children rode their bikes past it on summer evenings, daring one another to go closer. None of them ever did. Their parents told them stories about a girl who had vanished long ago, but the names blurred over time, and only the feeling stayed, that uneasy respect for a place that had once known sorrow. Sheriff Dalton returned one last time before retirement. He parked by the edge of the field and stepped out into the wind. The earth was soft beneath his boots, the air smelling faintly of rain. He walked until he reached the spot marked by an old fence post, where the searchers had once stood shoulder to shoulder, calling a name that never answered. The grass bowed as he passed, and when he stopped, he saw them. A small circle of daisies, fresh, white, perfect. He knelt down, touching one petal between his fingers. It was real, fragile, and alive. No one had been out here in weeks. No one had reason to. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching, but there was only the wind and the faint sound of the corn brushing against itself. For a long moment he stayed there, eyes closed, listening to the field breathe. He thought of Walter, alone at his table with the lamp burning low, of the man who had waited for truth until it finally came from the ground. He thought of Annie, 16, forever, her life folded neatly into a box that had waited half a century to be found. And he thought of Edwin Carr, the man who had mistaken guilt for devotion, who had planted his own punishment in the soil and watered it with prayer. Dalton reached into his pocket and took out the sheriff's badge he would soon turn in. He laid it in the grass beside the flowers, a small act of surrender to the silence that had done more work than any man. Then he whispered her name once, the way you do when you are not calling for someone but returning them to the world. The sun began to sink behind the hills, turning the field gold, the same color it must have been the day she disappeared. The wind softened. The petals stopped trembling. For the first time in 70 years the land seemed at peace. Later that night, when the moon rose over Hensley County, a passing trucker swore he saw a figure standing in the field. A girl with her hair caught by the wind, her dress pale against the dark. He said she was looking toward the horizon, not back at the town, and that beside her feet a ring of daisies glowed faintly in the moonlight. No one believed him. The next morning the field was empty again, the grass unmarked, the air still. But if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can still hear the soft rustle of stems bending under invisible hands, a rhythm that sounds almost like breathing. Because some stories never really end. They settle into the soil and wait, patient as seeds, until someone remembers to listen. And somewhere beneath the Nebraska sky, the flowers keep growing. If you have made it this far, you already know that this story was never only about a girl who vanished. It was about a silence that grew roots, about a man who mistook guilt for love, and about a town that built its peace on forgetting. For 50 years, the truth waited under the soil, patient and steady, until the earth itself decided it was time to speak. Annie Hensley's name is carved now on a small stone in Oak Hill Cemetery. No date of death, just the year she disappeared and the year she was found. Between them, a single line that holds half a century of unanswered prayers. People still leave flowers there. Sometimes daisies, sometimes cornflowers gathered from the edge of the road. No one knows who started it. Maybe it is habit, or maybe it is the field keeping its promise. And somewhere in the quiet, when the wind moves through the stalks just right, you can still hear her. Not as a ghost, not as a warning, but as a presence that reminds us what happens when kindness is mistaken for safety, and when silence becomes easier than truth. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that memory can be a kind of justice, make sure you like this video. Leave a comment telling me what you think really happened out there in that field, and subscribe for the next forgotten case. Because the earth keeps secrets better than people do, but sooner or later, it always gives them back